Ladies and gentlemen, there's an age-old question that Christians and actually everybody has to answer, anybody who believes in God. If there is a good God, why is there evil? Why does he allow it? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it turns out that Christianity is the answer to the problem of evil. There would be no need for Jesus to add humanity to his deity if we had never sinned. He came to earth to take our punishment upon himself. And so this world is fallen and it needs a redeemer. But have you also noticed how fascinated we are with evil and how fascinated people are with murder and crime? In fact, I submit to you that if you look at the top podcasts in the country right now, a good portion of them will be crime podcasts. Evil. Why are people so fascinated with this? And is there any way we can use what is, of course, awful, evil, to bring people to Jesus? Well, actually, I think there is, and our guests today are making a wholehearted effort to do that. You, of course, know the great J. Warner Wallace. Oh, wait a minute. There's the applause for the great J. Warner Wallace, who's been on this program almost as much as I have. Jim has written so many great books. You know, he's been a cold case homicide detective for many years. He's now retired, but he's still writing books. And he's written a brand new book with somebody he says is better than him. That's his son, Jimmy Wallace, who's here with us. We're having fun here, friends. Jimmy, you have followed in your dad's footsteps and your granddad's footsteps. You're also a cop in the Los Angeles area right now. You also love comic books, and you and your dad put this brand new comic book together called a graphic novel. What's it about? Why'd you write it?
Well, first of all, we cannot let you be the only apologist in the comic book space, okay? So partly it's just like a competitive thing. You can't be the only one.
All right, I get it.
But no, we're not a very creative family, but we're very consistent. For 3 generations, we've been police officers, and now my dad came to faith when I was really little, and I was raised in the faith for most of my life. And a big part of my experience with Christianity was always apologetics and answering all these questions for why we should believe what we believe. And so, cut to the future. I decided to go try to get a master's degree in apologetics to try to mimic my dad in just one more way. Almost every single thing about my life is very similar to how he lived. So got to continue the emulation. And right around the time I was graduating from this program, we heard that David C. Cook, a Christian book publisher that my dad had worked with in the past, purchased a small independent comic book company and wanted to get into graphic novels. And I have been a lifelong avid reader of comic books. I continue to be. I'm absolutely obsessed with them. So this was a chance. I thought maybe we can put our heads together and do something to actually make a comic book together.
So you have an apologetics degree
Frank,
from
do you see, by the way, Frank?
What?
Frank, do you see, by the way, behind him? Those are not case files to criminal cases. That's just a small snapshot of his comic book collection that's been organized and categorized and alphabetized in boxes. He's not kidding when he says
that the screen is very thin, so you don't see how many rows of comics we have behind me.
Well, for those of you listening on the American Family Radio Network, you got to go to the YouTube channel to see that Jimmy Wallace has boxes and boxes of comic books behind him, and he's written a new one. It's better termed a graphic novel because this thing is brilliantly illustrated in full color, ladies and gentlemen, and it's quite long. I don't know how many pages it is. There's no page numbers in here. How are you supposed to figure out where you are? It's chapters and chapters. And there's this character in here, J. Warner Wallace, called Murf. He's kind of gruff. He's kind of a gruff 25-year veteran of the police force. Who did you pattern Murf after besides yourself?
So do you see why notice how he didn't ask Jimmy that question? He didn't ask you that question. He asked the gruff, because every other character in the book is actually not a grumpy old man except for this one. And so I guess I get credit for that. But yeah, a lot of it is we looked at, Jimmy listened to all my dad's stories for years. And I listened, of course, to my dad's stories for years when he was a cop. And he kind of represents that whole generation in the 60s and 70s of guys I knew when I first came on the job. So we're just like kind of channeling relationships we have with guys on the job. And sadly, it's probably true that everyone kind of comes in with the optimism that Jimmy had at 22 or 23. And then by the time you're 52 or 53, you're like, okay, now you find yourself in the same trajectory that a lot of law enforcement officers end up in, especially if they don't promote. When I say promote, I mean they become a sergeant, then a lieutenant, then a captain, and you become a little bit more administrative in your view of work. If you stay in the field with contact with victims and suspects, yeah, at some point, you are probably going to look a lot like Murf. And that's what we're trying to capture, our realistic characters. And that's what I hope we have. We've got a bunch of young guys in that and young gals in that book, but we also have this guy who's a little bit maybe worse for wear, to be honest.
What does that say about human nature, Jimmy, if people after so many years on the police force get almost cynical because they see the depravity of man over and over again? I mean, what does that really tell us about human nature and about how the Bible nails it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the bottom line is that people are just so sinful that the more you see of people, the more convinced you're going to be that maybe I just shouldn't trust anyone. One of the things that really surprised me when I was a brand new police officer, I'm just working patrol, and I still got my training officer kind of walking me through the ropes. I assumed, okay, yeah, if we catch a guy who we think is committing a crime, they're going to lie to us and say, I didn't do it, etc. I expect that. What was really shocking to me as a new cop was when I would talk to a person who was a victim. They came into the police station to report that they had been victimized, and I would catch them lying because maybe there's some part of the story that was embarrassing, or maybe they also did something illicit that kind of put them in this situation, and then they were maybe even truly victimized, but maybe there's some part of the story they don't really want to tell me. And my eyes are completely opened to the realization there's not this clear distinction of there's the good guys, there's the bad guys, and like never the two shall meet. But really there's this gradient of people, and even the people who are the quote unquote good guys have a lot of messed up stuff about them. And I think that that's something where an entire career, 20, 30 years of seeing this day in and day out, where you feel like, man, I'm really not sure what I can trust from the people around me. I hope that not everybody does this, but I think it would be natural for someone to say, maybe I just want to retreat from other people altogether. And I think you see that with a lot of cops that retire. They go buy a house in the woods or a farm far away, and they're just like, I'm out of here. I'm out of the city. I got to be far away from people.
Yeah, Jim, are you going to buy a house far out in the woods like your dad did, or what? What's going to happen?
I'm the thing that separates me from my dad is, I hate to say it this way, but it's my love of my children. I can't. I'm stuck here now. You know why I'm stuck here, Frank? I'm stuck here in the city because my son is still here in the city. And as long as he's here, I'm going to live as close to him as I can, right? I'm not letting him get too far away from me. So yeah, I think that ordinarily though, you're absolutely right. I mean, if I didn't have kids, or if my kids were like, we're going to live someplace out in the country, I'm there in a heartbeat, because it is true. You do develop a certain distrust, and you can't be that way. But that glass half empty skepticism does pay dividends if you're a police officer. Number one, you're not going to let your guard down. You're not going to get hurt, more than likely. Number two, you're probably going to identify the liar who's ultimately going to go to jail. Like, there's good reasons to be who Murf is in this book. Somebody who's like jaded enough to never believe anything on first blush. And he's going to end up teaching the other detectives in this story, as they're trying to catch the serial killer, he's going to be able to teach them something from a very cynical, fallen, secular culture, because that's who he is. The main characters in this book are not Christians. So we want to trace them, and how do they best explain the world around them? Because what we want is a book that hopefully is realistic, because most of the people we meet are like Murf, and on the job at least. And also, though, helps you to advance your own thinking about the Christian worldview. So that's kind of a line to walk, but that's what we're trying to do in the book.
Well, this book is totally realistic, except there's no cursing in it. Okay.
Yeah, well,
we don't.
Yeah.
No Christian.
Yeah, there are some limits, right?
The way
what
the
you can
cops
do.
actually talk. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, I know.
Fiddlesticks.
Yeah, exactly.
Got stuff like that, and fudge.
Yeah, and that's just the nature, right, of like, how do you create a book that's realistic?
Yeah.
Yet not every profane word is used as every part of speech that can possibly be, if it's a verb, it's an adjective, it's an adverb, it's a noun. We got to figure out a way to speak a little clearer.
Well, friends, if you have young people or anybody that's interested in graphic novels and crime, Case Files, Murder and Meaning, the brand new novel by Jimmy Wallace and J. Warner Wallace, hits the shelves April 1st, but you want to pre-order it. That'll help move it up the charts so more people will see it. Order it now. Back in 2 minutes. Don't go anywhere. can you use this fallen world to point people to Jesus? You know, if the world wasn't fallen, we wouldn't need Jesus. If we were perfect, we wouldn't need a Savior, but we're not. Yet young people and old people seem to be fascinated with crime. They seem to be fascinated with evil. They seem to be fascinated with danger. How can you leverage that to get people to realize that they are fallen and they need a Savior? One way you can do it is to pick up the brand new, beautifully illustrated book, graphic novel called Case Files. The subtitle is Murder and Meaning, and the authors are Jimmy Wallace and J. Warner Wallace. Of course, you've probably heard of J. Warner Wallace. He's written several great apologetics books. Cold Case Christianity is among them. In fact, there was an update to that recently. He's written Person of Interest, Forensic Faith, God's Crime Scene. He's written another one. Jim, we had the more recent one on The Truth in True Crime, and books are falling off my shelf right now. The Truth in True Crime. That's your most recent one other than this one. And so you're using what you've lived in the world of police work to bring people to Jesus and to make better disciples. How did this whole concept even come about? Let's start with you, Jimmy. How did this whole concept come about where you said, Dad, let's write a graphic novel?
Well, I've always been absolutely fascinated with comics. So I think that there was a sort of dream that I would love to actually get to contribute or do something in comic books. But I don't think I ever thought that was a realistic expectation or really a realistic dream for me. And I'm working full time as a police officer. It wasn't until we saw David C. Cook really wanted to make a move into the graphic novel space that we kind of saw an opportunity. Hey, let's pitch some ideas. Now, for this particular story, I think one of the things that really stood out to me as a police officer was the incredible value that human life has under the law. As a police officer, protecting human life justified almost anything that I could do, even though there was a bunch of other rules and regulations. On a normal day, I can't walk up to somebody's house and just kick in the door and come in and start rooting around their house and looking at their stuff, because we have the Fourth Amendment that protects us from that.
Unless you're an ex-president and you've got some files at your house, then you can kick down that door and come right on in. But I digress. Go ahead.
No comment from me on that one, I think. Okay, that's above my pay grade, I think. I won't speak officially on that one. But yeah, exactly, though. That's what we would expect, that when we're at our house, we have total security. And as a police officer, I cannot just go and do whatever I want just because I'm a cop and I think I can do it. There's all these rules and regulations I got to follow. But if I'm walking down the street and I hear someone screaming for help inside of a house, you better believe I can go and kick the door down and go in, because even though there's a law that says I can't do it, the preservation of human life is so valuable under the law that it supersedes all the other rules that I got to follow. And I realized that all cops understood this. We all understood that human life had incredible value that let us put it before everything else in our life. But almost no cop around me could tell you why human life is valuable. We just assumed it. And that's fine. There's a lot of people going around with a lot of assumptions. But if we really start to think about it, if someone actually asks you, why is human life more valuable than something else like privacy concerns or any other thing that you could think of, I think a lot of people would struggle to answer that. But Christianity offers a great answer. I think it's very clear that if human life has value, there must be a God that gives it that value. And so I think it just seemed natural that if we're going to do an apologetic message, but in a narrative about the police, that these things just kind of went hand in hand. And obviously we talked a lot about what was going to be the topics going into this, but I think that kind of made this a natural fit.
Jim, how did you weave in apologetics and theology and Jesus into a comic book that deals with murder? How did you weave that in there?
Well, I think you probably read about 70% of the book before you even think, is this a Christian book? This seems like it's treading on themes, because what we really wanted first was a narrative that would be compelling enough to stand on its own. So I want it to be a page turner without you having to think, well, I'm just muscling through it to learn something about Christianity. I want this to take you on for a ride. And so you become part of the narrative. And so as you're reading through this, at some point, you're going to realize we're touching on issues that have to do with value. So in other words, we wanted to just explore that one issue. How do we ground human value? Because just think about this, Frank. Today there's going to be murders in every city in America. And most of those murders, if not all of them, will not make the news anymore. There's it's just noise. But unless, of course, a particular person gets interested, somebody who the culture says, that person's valuable. Now we've got a national headline. Well, why? What makes one murder more significant than others? Well, it's clear that as a culture, we assign value to people. And we usually assign those values to people for all the wrong reasons. And so we have to ask the question, and so this is a serial killer who's selectively picking targets that are increasingly more valuable according to culture. And we want to explore the idea, are they really more valuable? Is one really more valuable than the next? And if not, why not? Like, how do we ground the value? Because most of it is going to be, well, yeah, everyone's important. But, achievements and your contributions to society, that makes you more valuable. Blah, 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 blah. Well, in the eyes of God, of course, it's a very different story. And so we want to be able to ground it. And so in this kind of a narrative, we're just going to explore the typical kinds of reactions you might see from homicide investigators who are assigned these cases. Mm-hmm. Which ones are they going to spend their time on? And then explore, why would that be fair or unfair? So I think there are some ways for us to explore that. Now, I think pretty much every character in this story, except for one, is not a believer, which is probably about the right proportion if you're working in a law enforcement agency. If you've got 10 people in your life that you are considered, but you'd be lucky if one or two of them were a Christian. I think we are much fewer in terms of population comparison, people and Christians who are in law enforcement. So I just think so it's good for us. This is not one of those stories that we're going to try to land perfectly, because we know that's not how life is. We did not want to over-spiritualize it. We did not want to make a Pollyannish kind of world that in the end, everyone ends up happy and saved. That's not this kind of story. This is a story that's very much like the kinds of things you experience as a cop. And that means it's going to be messy. But shouldn't the Christian worldview make sense in light of the messy world we live in? If it is true, it has to make sense of evil. It has to make sense of what drives us to do stupid things. It has to make sense if this is an ugly scene. And this is a book where I don't think, I was talking to Susie, my wife, about this, Jimmy's mom. And I was like, this, if you've watched anything on TV that's a cop show, you've seen as much blood and guts as you're going to see in this book. As a matter of fact, we were talking about how so many of the commercials for movies, like during the Super Bowl, we're like going, whoa, is that appropriate for a Super Bowl? Right. But I think your kids have already seen this. So I think that this is something that's accessible even to younger kids. But it really is, I think our audience is anyone who's interested in these kinds of stories. And of course, what we want to do in the end is leverage this. But let me just say one thing. I think Jimmy would probably talk about this even more. We didn't illustrate this. We wrote it. But we didn't illustrate it. Really, Jimmy did most of the heavy lifting on this, but we didn't illustrate it. It turns out that illustrators are the stars of this show. And in the end, we got we were blessed to be able to work with fine illustrators who could take our ideas and the personalities we were creating and just bring them to life. I mean, there's no way that Jimmy and I illustrate my own books, but no, this is a entirely different kind of art form. So I think it's basically a storyboarded movie. And you'll get to watch the storyboard.
And it's in full color, ladies and gentlemen. Again, the book, for those of you just tuning in, is called Case Files, Murder and Meaning. I assume that this is a series because Murder and Meaning is the subtitle. There's probably going to be a follow-on because Murf, the main character in this graphic novel, just goes on to another case at the end. I assume that you guys are going to write more about this. Is that right, Jimmy?
Yes, we talked David C. Cook into at least doing 2 of these. So we are hard at work on volume 2. We're pushing back and forth ideas right now. And that's actually what I'm supposed to be doing as soon as I get off this phone call with you is update our notes. And we pass notes back and forth and have long phone calls and all that. So we're excited for the second one, but hopefully we get enough interest in this first one that we get the chance to keep going on that second project.
Jim, what is the biggest misconception do you think the general public has about police work, and particularly maybe homicide police work?
Well, I think one thing that's interesting, I discovered this was what you and I were speaking across the country together, is that if you're working in law enforcement in this generation in which Jimmy is working, or you've been on the job 15 years and you've had a life pre-George Floyd and a life post-George Floyd, pre-BLM, post-BLM, just pre-cultural shift. Because what happened when that all occurred is that the DAs in the major cities across America flipped, and they started prosecuting police officers. That became their target. And this is an entirely different kind of culture in which we live. And the amount of bad feelings about cops is pretty high, even right now in culture, even with the shift in the last year, it is still pretty high. But most people don't even realize that detectives are cops, are police officers. Like they think those are two different things. The uniformed police officer, that's like, no, we're actually uniformed police officers, but we've just taken this position, and now our uniforms in the locker for a while, unless it's parade day or get called out on overtime. But you are uniformed cops. I think it's interesting that people come up to me and all the time say, "Well, I want to be a detective. What do I have to do?" And I'll say, "Well, you're going to spend some time, responding to domestic violence calls and handling drunk, fights between drunk people at bars, and as a police officer." They're like, "What? Oh yeah, you got to. If you don't think that's for you, and you don't, then this is going to be for you, because it turns out that's probably going to be the first 10 years of your career. It's just working as a police officer." So I think that's one of the misconceptions, is they kind of think that, hey, you see uniform and detectives, but these are all folks who just a few years earlier were in uniform themselves. So that's part of it. And I think the other thing about detective investigations is that we have a tendency to think that these are really super fast paced, and sometimes they are. But there's a lot of kind of critical thinking that has to go into working a case. And it's not as glamorous. It's kind of like patrol. Hours of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. Mm-hmm. That's kind of what the job entails. And there's some of that is true, I think, also for detectives.
So you always got to be on your toes. You never know when that moment of terror is going to arise, which
that's right.
creates a lot of stress.
Well, and you know what they call that too? It's called in law enforcement from a psychological perspective, as a counselor now, as a chaplain for officers, it's called hypervigilance. This idea that you're not just working and patrolling, that you're constantly trying to guard your safety. Like, where is the next threat to your safety coming from? And hypervigilance it has a biochemical response. It starts to ruin your heart. It starts to ruin other aspects of your physical health. And so you have to kind of moderate and figure out how to deal with the hypervigilance.
Jimmy, has that been an issue for you? You've been on the force for about 10 years now. Are you like a German Shepherd all the time, looking around going, where's my next threat coming from?
My wife would occasionally, especially when I worked patrol, she'd occasionally come up and visit. We'd grab a little coffee or something like that when I was working. And she always talked about how weird I was when I was at work. If she came to see me at work, I wouldn't make eye contact with her that much because I'm looking at everybody else around me. And she always said I was twitchy when I was at work. But I think there is something to be said about that. But I think it cuts both ways. It can be addictive, that kind of adrenaline spike. You're always waiting for that next one to come. So I don't know. It cuts both ways. It's probably not good for you long term.
Well, you're going to have an adrenaline spike by reading The Case Files, Murder and Meaning by Jimmy Wallace and J. Warner Wallace. A lot of fun, but also some serious theology and apologetics in here. Don't go anywhere. We're back in 2 minutes. Welcome back to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with me, Frank Turek, on the American Family Radio Network. I'll get back to my guests, J. Warner Wallace and Jimmy Wallace, the new book, Case Files, Murder and Meaning. You're going to want to get this, especially if you know somebody who is a young person interested in crime, interested in comic books, and interested in apologetics, because this book will help bring them along in a fun way. I want to mention that this Monday, I'll be in Louisville, Kentucky, speaking at an unusual conference. It's called the National Conference on Sexual Exploitation. These are people that are trying to deal with that awful issue, and I'm speaking there on Monday, the 31st. Then I will be, where else am I going to be next week? This coming week. Oh, yeah, this Thursday, the 3rd, going to be at Grand Canyon University. We're going to be doing an outdoor event with Lucas Miles. We'll be somewhere on the quad, a Prove Me Wrong event. And he is the president of TPUSA Faith. That's Charlie Kirk's organization. So we're going to go to Grand Canyon University in Phoenix. And then the next couple of days, I'll be at the Unshaken Conference at Calvary Church, Albuquerque. That's Skip Heitzig's church. I'll be with Lisa Childers, Natasha Crane on the 5th, April 5th, for the Unshaken Conference. And then I'll be speaking that night and the Sunday morning services on the 6th at Calvary Church, Albuquerque. We'll be talking about If God, Why Evil. Then on Tuesday, the 8th, I'll be with my friend Tim Ramsey, the great Tim Ramsey, down at at Huntsville. That is a college down there, Sam Houston University. Will be doing I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist on the 8th. That is in the evening down there, Central Time Zone. Look at our website for more, crossexamine.org. Then the following week out in Ohio, you can see all of it on our website. Hope to see you wherever you are if you're out there in that part of the country. Let me go back to my guests, J. Warner Wallace and Jimmy Wallace. Jim, before the break, we were talking a little bit about what happens to you when you're either in the military or you're a cop for many years. You get hypervigilant. You're always looking around. You got adrenaline pumping. What does that do to you long term?
Well, this is the problem, right? So we started off working, Susie and I, chaplaining with military at Operation Heal Our Patriots. We just kind of were volunteers there, either serving in the ministry or just kind of helping with them some of the curriculum. It's marriage resilience for people who have been involved in the military. And there's something slightly different about law enforcement because there's never a time where you're on the job when you're not hyper vigilant. There just isn't, especially if you're working patrol. And what happens is sometimes, one of the biggest things in communication with marriages is communication. One of the biggest challenges in marriage is communication. If you're taking a marriage counseling course or you're taking a class in marriage, you're probably going to be talking about communication at some point. And it turns out that cops are really excellent communicators because we're paid to do this. We have to write reports. We have to convince a DA that this is a case that's worth filing. We have to testify in court. We have to do interviews with people all the time. Well, it turns out that hypervigilance, this idea that I'm constantly looking for the threat, not just looking for people that need to be dealt with or responding to calls, but I'm constantly worried about what might kill me because we're always a target. Well, that turns out that's all about adrenaline and how adrenaline is used by hypervigilance to kind of be on the alert at all times. Well, it turns out by coincidence, I guess, that you're the most communicative when your adrenaline is really pumping. So in those moments where you're staying in that position of hypervigilance, you actually are a pretty decent communicator if you were pressed into service. Now, what happens, of course, is you go home. And when you go home, you have a dramatic adrenaline dump. And that means that you're the worst communicator in the world in those moments where you're on the backside of a hypervigilance cycle. And the studies show that it takes sometimes between 12 and 18 hours to kind of ramp back up and overcome the adrenaline dump. Now, there's the problem for us as law enforcement is that 18 hours from my end of shift, I'm already back at work. Mm-hmm. Like I'm never quite recovering from. So that's why often people like Jimmy and I, if we get a 3-day weekend, like the third day is a good day to talk about all the things you need to talk about this week, because it turns out that you are probably in the best position to just talk like a normal person. Because it turns out that the problem for cops is not that they don't know how to communicate, it's that they refuse to. And most of the time that's because they're recovering from this hypervigilance cycle, which has depleted them of all the adrenaline. And that's one of the things that we can actually describe. If you look at the book case files we just did, you're going to see that there's one character in this that is struggling in his off duty with the hypervigilance dump. And this is very common in law enforcement. And so you wonder why are these sad creatures always appearing, as the trope in these scenes on TV? Well, it's because this is really part of our job experience. And so it always kind of comes back, right? You're off duty now and you're trying to get back on your feet and you're trying to make sense of the world, and you're probably drinking too much and doing stuff you shouldn't be doing because you're just trying to make sense of life after the adrenaline dump.
It's got to be difficult. I know in the military it was kind of the same thing, although I think the military, you sort of know when you're in danger. You never know when you're in danger as a cop because you're in the field all the time. In the military.
And the other thing too, Frank, is that what I found in comparing the two groups, it's that in the military, you know who the enemy is.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And in law enforcement, it turns out that it's much more blurred. And Jimmy and I have always talked about that. It's like, you don't know where the next threat's coming from. And you respond to a call and then he'll say that he's the guy who did it. And you're focused on this bad guy, quote unquote. And suddenly you're getting knocked from behind by the guy who called you to the call. Mm-hmm. The alleged victim is now jumping in the fight on it. What? Like you don't know who. And it turns out that, in military, the bad guy's wearing a different uniform. You can tell he's not one of us.
Right.
But these all look like us.
Yeah.
So it's like, I'm not sure who I can trust. And
Of
that's
course,
the part of the challenge,
That's one of the things that made the Vietnam War all the more difficult. Because a lot of people weren't in uniform who were fighting against the Americans. So that was a big problem. Let's talk about fiction itself for a second, Jimmy. This is an attempt, a very colorful attempt, by the way, an entertaining attempt to use fiction to put forth a message, but not in an overt, cheesy Christian way, as so many Christian books and movies do. You're rolling your eyes going, come on, it doesn't work like this in real life. So why did you guys decide to go the fiction route to try and communicate and entertain at the same time?
Well, fiction is something that's always been really important to me, and in particular, comic books as a medium. This is something I grew up with, and I just knew from my personal experience how powerful they could be. I think even though as a kid, I was maybe 8 or 9 when my parents came to faith, and I'm going to church, I'm reading my Bible, and I've got good parents to teach me. I would say one of the most important kind of impacts on my moral development was comic books. I remember reading my uncle had this great collection of Chris Claremont X-Men comics, and the X-Men were these superheroes hated and feared by the world they were sworn to protect. And they were, every day there's this bigoted society they live in who hate them, but they're willing to risk their lives to protect them anyways, because doing the right thing was so important that even though they were going to get no credit for it and they're actually going to be persecuted for doing the right thing, they still had to do it. And this was really, one of the big kind of moral values that I took with me, even to this day in my life. It's not that it's apart from my Christian faith, but I could see the way that a story, and this wasn't even a Christian story, it was just a secular superhero story. I could see the way that it affected me. And so I know the power that fiction can have. And I just want to point that, we're going to create our fiction. We're just going to try to point that in the direction of God and hopefully use the power that fiction has to point towards something greater.
So,
Jim, without giving the plot away too much, how does this book in some way point to Christianity or Jesus?
So it's all about value. And I think Jimmy's done a great job in the story, just kind of embedding little clues to what are the things we think are valuable and just little teases about it. And then of course, we're going to apply it to this increasingly culturally valuable set of victims. So he started off murdering somebody who the culture might not even post that on social media. They might not even cover it in the news. But eventually these targets become bigger and bigger in Los Angeles County, where we have a movie industry and all of that. So you've got all kinds of people you could pick as a potential target that would get the attention of culture. And then we're going to have the characters along the way are going to be thinking about these issues. And without giving it away, that the actual nemesis here, the villain in this story, is somebody who feels like this is an important issue to him. And he feels like he's been unjustly treated on the basis of this. So now we can bring the story to a crescendo and at least talk about this issue of value. What is valuable about humans? Why is it we think that some humans are more valuable than others? And is there a Christian voice in the storytelling, a character or a voice in the storytelling that could occasionally come back in and center the thinking of other characters, center without preaching, without being too, and this is going to be, look, if you're a Christian working in law enforcement, you probably have experienced this where people kind of minimize you. They feel like, this guy, it's always the same with this guy. They don't even feel like they can be themselves around you because they feel like this is the guy who is the Christian in the group. And so we wanted to actually portray that guy in this way, right? Somebody who's got lots of expertise to give, but is probably minimized by cops who think they're maybe a streetwiser or a little more rough around the edges. So we've got a character like that in this book. And so you'll see some of that tension. But like you said, we're not going to land every plane smoothly at the end of the trip because that's not the way that life really happens. And so we don't know exactly what the future for Murf is in future stories, but it's going to be a up and down bumpy ride because that's what life is, especially for guys. Like my dad is a lot like Murf in many, many ways. And here he is in his 80s. And I don't think I hope he's closer, but I know that part of his problem is his battle with his own experiences as a detective and as a police officer in some of the roughest years that was happening. So I think I'm looking at his life. It may not land like a happy ending. I don't know. And there's a part of me as I watch Jimmy develop this character Murf that I'm thinking, in some ways he's very similar.
Jimmy, how does the experiences you've had as a police officer seeing some pretty awful things, how has that affected your faith, if at all?
I think I was lucky in that I came into law enforcement as a Christian with a great theological background and a deep background in apologetics. I'd been doing so much studying before I got into law enforcement. I think I came with a pretty solid basis. If anything, for me, my experience in law enforcement have only kind of served to support the claims that I already came in with, that all humans are sinful, that we need forgiveness because we're not going to be able to get this together on our own, that a lot of the things that I value, like human life, the purpose of life, all these things, I can still look at God and go, okay, he's a better answer to what's the purpose of this? My purpose is not to be the best cop or get the most notoriety during my career, because when we retire, everybody gets forgotten and there's somebody new coming along. I think that my Christian worldview has really helped, I think, keep me grounded. And I hope it's going to keep me from turning out to be somebody like Murf at the end of my career when it's my time to retire.
Who is Murf? You got to get the book. Case Files, Murder and Meaning, a graphic novel by my guest today, Jimmy Wallace and J. Warner Wallace. It is beautifully illustrated and it's well written, and it's going to be something that young people or anybody interested in comics will want to get a hold of. You'll want to get a hold of it. Order it now before April 1st. See you in just 2 minutes. Don't go anywhere. How can you grab the attention of young people without hitting them over the head with a Bible if they're not Christians right now? They're not going to be interested if you just hit them over the head with a Bible. Sometimes they're going to rebel. How can you take a gentler, more intriguing approach? One thing you can do is get them this brand new book called Case Files, Murder and Meaning by my guest today, Jimmy Wallace and J. Warner Wallace. And I know there's been some people who have looked at this book before it's come out, and they're amazed, Jimmy, at how kind of up to date it is with regard to the lingo and the language used in it. So give us a little glimpse of what that's about and how you decided to write it this way.
Well, I'm glad that they feel like that. I don't know if it was even something on the top of my mind. Hey, I'm trying to be trendy or current. I think I'm still in law enforcement. I still work full time. I've been working for 13 years. So it's a while, but it's not, in the grand scheme of things, it's not that long. And so I think when I was trying to write the dialogue for the characters, I just thought back to conversations I've had or I've overheard, and tried to make sure that the characters, although the characters are not real people per se, that they feel real. And so I think some of this I may have even done unconsciously. I know my wife, when she read it, she was really like, why do they keep calling one of the characters has just come back from maternity leave? Why do they call it baby leave? It's not called that. It's called maternity leave. I'm thinking, I didn't even realize there was a difference. In my world, working in law enforcement at my age, we call it baby leave. That's the only way I ever heard it. So I think some of it may just be by osmosis. But I think what I wanted to do is, both of us, we wanted to create characters that would feel real to people who had been in law enforcement. And I think all these characters are motivated in a different way by their career. And I think one of the problems, one of the joys, but also one of the weaknesses in law enforcement is that most cops take a lot of identity in what they do. And the problem with taking identity in something like your career is that it is finite, that it eventually is going to end. And so the characters who are younger in this book, they're still hoping, I want to be the greatest cop. I'm going to get notoriety. Everybody's going to see what a great investigator I am. And we have one character at the end of his career who's starting to realize this is everything that I am. And now I can retire. But if I retire, what am I? And so I think that there's a lot of struggle that I see just in my personal life with people and their own identity and tying it so closely to law enforcement. Really, if we want to have a satisfying identity, we have to tie it to something which is eternal, that's going to outlast everything else. And so I wanted as one of our many goals, I wanted these characters to feel real. And this is a real struggle I see a lot around me.
But Jim, you've said before, even though you're a Christian, you had books written about Christianity when you retired. How did you feel the day you basically hung up your uniform for the last time and left the police department?
It was a struggle. And I held on to that title for I was glad to have cases that were not quite done yet. I was glad to have cases that would draw me back into the courtroom because I felt like I could continue. I was still valuable. I still had some worth to my agency. And still, I was measuring myself this way on the basis of achievement. So I was really glad I still had some dangling participles, right? I mean, I've got a case right now that's getting ready to go to trial again in October. There are lots of things that I could go back to. And then what I did is I simply overcame that. I'll just be honest with you. I overcame that crisis of identity by replacing it with another one. I'm the author of. Just another way to identify yourself. I think when Jimmy came home years ago, we came home from a trip, Susie and I, and they wanted to meet us for dinner, Olivia and Jimmy, and announced to us that they were pregnant with our first grandchild. Like, it struck me that we all have multiple identities, and cops really struggle with this because we are basically superheroes. We put on a uniform, we go out and we save people. The way that Jimmy talked about Wolverine and talked about X-Men and how X-Men personified this idea of serving a group, serving a culture that doesn't even like you. That's what cops think they're doing every day. And it becomes your identity. You're wearing the superhero uniform. When Jimmy came home and said he was going to have a grandchild, we're going to have a grandchild, I realized that I had placed my identity in probably all the wrong things from just a worldly perspective. But the bigger issue was that here I was a Christ follower, and I still did not, practically speaking, have my identity in Christ. It was always in other things. I mean, I assumed my identity was in Christ because I'm a Christ follower. But to be honest, I wasn't living as though it was. I was living as though my identity was in everything else. And I think it just, so for example, I knew for me, this is just for me, that in order to retain my identity, I was going to have to walk away from the things that I had been placing my identity in. I was going to have to minimize those, put those in little boxes, because this is one of the reasons why I don't speak as much publicly anymore as I used to, because I realized I was simply taking all of that misplaced identity drive in law enforcement and now placing it in this second career. So for me, and I see this in the character Murf in this, maybe Jimmy's been watching me. I've been very verbal about it. I've talked about it quite a bit, and maybe he's seeing it. So now what I'm thinking is, okay, look, how can I do all of these things to the extent that I feel called to do them, yet not place my identity? I needed a better balance. Murf has no balance. This is so typical of cops who work in the job really, really long. Often they end up in second and third marriages. They end up with, they end up by themselves at the end of their lives. It's not uncommon. At least it wasn't in my generation. So a lot of this is about trying to form your identity. And that's what we're trying to do. This is a very realistic story in that sense. Now, it's not a downer. I mean, this is an action story. We're on the hunt of a serial killer, but we also want to develop the characters that are realistic characters. And I think that's what we tried to do in this book. And you'll see when you read it, that if you're anywhere in the culture, you're going to recognize a little bit of yourself in one of these characters. And that's what we're trying to do, because we think that we can pull you into a story and teach you something about the Christian worldview, at least make you hungry to ask a question about the Christian worldview. And that's what I hope this book does.
Ladies and gentlemen, as we said before on this program, Christianity is the only worldview where you don't achieve your identity, you receive your identity. Christ has provided you with your identity, and it's hard for all of us. And Jimmy, I mean, you're following in your dad's footsteps, you're following in your grandfather's footsteps. I mean, you guys have a heritage of being law enforcement officers, particularly there in Southern California. Yet you said something earlier in this interview, which kind of struck me, and that is, there's going to come a day when we're all going to be forgotten. What then? Unpack that a little bit further, and why is that an important thing to realize?
Yeah, I think I just, as a young officer, I dealt with the same issues. Even though I saw my dad retire maybe a year or two into my career, I think like a year and a half, something like that. And I started to see, okay, hey, there's maybe an issue of at some point we got to leave this identity behind. I knew I had so much in front of me. I could still give my whole heart to this. And I really started to see in myself giving all this weight to what I was doing now, I wanted to get on special assignments. I wanted to solve certain cases that were the hard cases to solve, and all this. This whole time I'm a Christian, and I think that I was always content to say, like, yeah, I intellectually assent to Christian beliefs, and I have a lot of head knowledge. I understand apologetics, and I read my theology and whatever. But I think I was one of those people. I hear this a lot. People often say in church, oh, I'm just not much of a prayer warrior. I'm just not much of this thing. I got my own area of faith. And I think I was content to go, I got the head knowledge. That's enough for me on my faith. And I can give my whole life. I'm in it with this police thing. But I believe. And I think at some point I started to realize that what I'm giving all my heart to and what I'm in on a day-to-day basis is something that is temporary. It can be easily taken away from me. I really need to stop putting all my heart in this worldly thing, and I need to start living. I need to be in my faith in a more real sense. So I think that's something I've struggled with in my own way, even though I'm still working. I think I've struggled with my own way, and I just don't want to take identity anymore in anything other than the life of faith.
Now, Jim, whenever you do a book, you always provide some extra resources for readers, and you and Jimmy, this is no exception for Case Files. People can get the book on Amazon, which is fine, and if you pre-order it, that'll be helpful. But if they pre-order it from you, or if they go to coldcasechristianity.com, there's a lot more going on. To tell us about
right.
that.
And then I feel like, look, Amazon's kind of controlling the world right now in terms of books, and you and I both know that. But I'll tell you this, you can buy the book anywhere, but we want you to come through our website. We're not going to sell it to you from our website. We're just going to point you to a bookseller. But what I would like you to get are all the free resources that we designed to go with this. And there's a number of things we think will be helpful. Number one, we know that this is a book that's going to raise, hopefully, interest in the Christian worldview, even amongst non-believers. In the back of the book, there is a link, a QR code, as you can download the digital copy of Case Closed, which is our short case for the resurrection. Yeah, it's in that last page. So that idea is, hey, if you're reading this book and you're like, well, if I'm going to build my life around a Christian worldview, like, what is the evidence for Christianity? Well, that link will bring you to a free digital download. But also, if you buy the book, we're going to send you that free, it's like an Easter book we designed for next year, but that is going to be available to anyone who buys this book. In addition, our 30-session, 10.5-hour video curriculum of the class I teach at Gateway Baptist Seminary, that class with all of the written material that comes along with it is available for free for anyone who purchases this book. And the idea here is, look, and also there's a digital conversation guide. So that if you get the book and you give it to somebody, it's going to raise certain questions. Are you ready to answer those questions? This conversation guide will help you be ready to answer the questions in that conversation. Look, in the end, I know, as you do, that there's no power in my case for the Christianity. There is no power in that. The power's in the gospel. The case for the gospel is there's no power in that, Frank. It's all this does is it removes the barriers that prevented me from hearing the gospel clearly. So for a lot of people, they just need to be moved in a direction where they're willing to hear the gospel, and that's where the power is. So how can you use a book like this to prepare people to hear the gospel? That's what we're trying to do with all those extra resources. Are you ready to make a case? Are you ready to share the gospel? We hope that the course and the free digital materials will get you ready.
So if they go to coldcasechristianity.com and do what? What do they have to do?
You'll see our book pages. Just for this book, if you go to casefilesgraphicnovel.com, casefilesgraphicnovel.com, you'll see the landing page with the link for all the free resources. Look, in the end, I get it. There are lots of things to look at. We want to offer you value for every book we sell.
So check it out, friends. This is a great graphic novel that is really for all ages, but especially for the young, especially if they're interested in graphic novels. Go to coldcasechristianity.com, get all those extra resources. But wherever you get the book, get it. It's called Case Files, Murder and Meaning, with my guests today, Jimmy Wallace and Jay Warner Wallace. Great having you on, guys. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
All right, friends, check the calendar. I'm going to be in Grand Canyon University on April 3rd, and then Sam Houston State on April 8th. See you out there. God bless. See you next week.
If you're looking for solid answers to life's biggest questions, don't miss the latest episode of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, iHeart, OnePlace, and Podchaser. Tune in, discover the truth, and share it with someone who needs it. Let's keep spreading the truth together.